Hi, I'm Zach. Welcome to another episode of Lumix tutorial. Today we are going to talk about frame rate. I want to ask you a question. Do you know what is a video? So actually a video is nothing more than just a series of photos playback in 1 second. Typically 24 photos per second, also known as 24 frames per second. Hence we have the name frame per second, FPS. There are all kinds of different FPS. We have the 24 frames per second, typically what you see in cinema, Hollywood standard. We have 30 frames per second, we have 60 frames per second. 120, it's into the slow motion field. We have 300, and we have even crazy thousands or 10,000 frames per second in slow-mo camera. All these different frame rates, how can they be processed? It's up to the camera processing power. Some like slow-mo camera, they have really great processors that can process thousands or even millions frames per second. But normally for us, the prosumer, the consumer level camera, like the GS6, GS5, all these consumer level camera, we usually have about around 24 frames per second all the way up to 300 frames per second. And this all dictates by the processing power of the camera, of course. So the higher the frame rate will also means the darker the video, because it needs to process more frame, you need to capture more frames in 1 second. So same goes to the shutter speed. If you have a faster shutter speed, you want to capture a very narrow time in 1 second, you will have very little light allowed into the sensor. So the higher the frame rate, the darker the video. So the question here is, we have all these kind of frame rates. So when do we use these frame rates? How do we choose certain frame rates for our shots? Usually for talking shot, the dialogue shot, things that we talk, we know that we won't slow it down. Probably we will shoot in our playback frame per second. So if you are intended to output the video in 24 frames per second, you will shoot in 24 frames per second. And if your output is 30 frames per second, you will shoot in 30 frames per second, because normal talking shot like this is not required to be slowed down. So we just shoot in the output frames. Another reason for doing that is that usually for the lower frames per second in a camera, we will have more features. For example, 24 frames, the camera will have a better color quality, a deeper color depth compared to when you're shooting higher frame rate. For some camera might not have the full color available for you when you're shooting, like let's say 120 frames per second. So shooting in 24 frames per second in most dialogue shot is what we usually do, the talking shot. And for more dramatic effects, something that we want to slow it down a bit but not too much, things like when some guy enter the room, something happens, someone goes on the stage, you want to slow it down some and to present some dramatic effects. We usually will shoot it in 60 frames per second or 120 frames per second and slow it down. And for faster moving objects, say you are filming a sports event, somebody running, somebody jumping, or a football, a basketball, things like that. If you want to slow it down, you need to shoot in even higher frame rates, because these movements are even faster. So a camera like a Lumix GS6 can shoot up to 300 frames per second in variable frame rate mode, and that give you about, if you play back in 24 frames per second, you get about 10 to 12 times slower video when playback in normal speed. So it's a very slow moving video, and for slowing down very fast moving objects. So moving on, we're gonna talk a bit about high frame rate and variable frame rate. So high frame rate is more than 120 frames per second. So why do you need to shoot in high frame rate? For instance, the GS6 can shoot in 4K 120 frames per second. That's considered high frame rate with audio. We don't always need a faster frame rate, but there are certain usage for these faster frame rates, and there's certain advantage for them. For example, when you are planning to do green screen, when you're planning to do CG in post, and you are planning to add VFX to your film, we will often want to shoot in a good color. We'll talk about color in another video. And second of all is high frame rate. So higher frame rate will more likely have less motion blur to your object. Motion blur is the blur effect when something moving fast. So the less motion blur is easier for the VFX artist in post to crop out your image, to add something, to remove the green color in the green screen, things like that. It will be cleaner in terms of cropping out stuff in post. In short, it's easier for post. So that's why we want to shoot high frame rate in certain given scenes. In your camera, you might also find this VFR, variable frame rate, that allow you to shoot up to, in GS6 is about 300 frames per second. So what is variable frame rates? It pushes the limits of the high frame rates of the camera with some compromisations. So for instance, if you want to shoot in 300 frames per second, which is really, really slow, you will need to give up something like the audio recording. It won't have audio when you record. And the second is that you won't have autofocus. So these two things you won't have, but you get a very, very high frame rate up to 300 frames per second. That is VFR and variable frame rates. Choosing all these frame rates sometimes will result in a flicker video. That is because out of sync with the shutters. So we will have another separate video talk about shutter speed and shutter angle and synchro scan to get rid of this black bars, this synchronizations problem when you're shooting in different frame rates. So this is the basic run through of frame rates. In short, we have all kinds of different frame rates available in the camera. You need to understand your workflow, you need to understand your output, what kind of work you're trying to deliver, and what kind of frame rates you will choose. That is up to you as a creator to decide. There's no best frame rate and there's no worst frame rate. Depends on your work, depends on your creative directions. So as always, if you have any questions about frame rates or any problem, you can comment down below and some professionals from us will get back to you. I'm Zach, thanks for watching, and I will see you on the next video of Lumix Thailand.